In the first 14 days of the invasion of Ukraine, Russia launched over 775 ballistic and cruise missiles. Many airports, TV towers, and civilian buildings were destroyed. In addition, countless missiles and unguided bombs were launched from Russian combat aircraft. Reportedly, Russia has 923 multi-role fighter aircraft, 467 attack aircraft, 124 bombers, and 546 attack helicopters. In contrast, Ukraine has 98 combat aircraft and just 15 helicopters. Of course, in practice, the number of operational aircraft is much less. But despite having a superior air force compared to that of Ukraine, the Russian Air Force has failed to achieve air superiority during the first 2 weeks of the war and appears to perform limited sorties into Ukrainian airspace. But why is that? In order to win a war in modern day, one side has to achieve air superiority. This means having control over the airspace in a way that permits them to conduct air attacks at any given time and place without interference from defensive air and missile threats. This is not a good situation for the defending side, as they would not be able to protect themselves against air attacks. To achieve air superiority, it's crucial to perform SEAD, or suppression of enemy air defenses. This is usually followed by DEED, which stands for destruction of enemy air defenses. But Russians have failed to engage in SEAD missions, and is widely believed to be the reason why so far we have seen very limited aircraft being deployed. It is also the reason for a large number of Russian combat aircraft being shot down. But before getting into SEAD and DEED, let's go over what Western analysts expected to happen during the first days of invasion and what really happened. On February 24, 2022, Russia began its invasion of Ukraine by firing over 100 ballistic and cruise missiles targeting military infrastructure, like runways, radar stations, and military bases. We should mention that many analysts were surprised that Russia did not use a lot more missiles on day one, given the large scale of the invasion. For reference, the US Navy launched some 320 Tomahawk cruise missiles on the first night of Operation Iraqi Freedom in March of 2003. While missiles can destroy static targets, they are ineffective against mobile targets without having precise intel. And this is why missile attacks are usually followed by a large fixed-wing strike package to finish off the mobile air defenses. But in this case, Russia never did that. Given the number of Russian ground assets deployed on Ukrainian territory, it is very curious why the use of aviation has been so limited to date. One speculation could be that the Russian military overestimated their own capabilities while underestimating the Ukrainians. They may have bet on a swift victory by their ground forces, which meant that an extensive use of operational tactical aviation was not necessary. On February 28, 2022, 4 days after the invasion began, Russia declared total air superiority over Ukraine. However, 1 week later, Ukrainians continued limited sorties of their own combat aircraft and drones. Ukraine also continued to have a substantial amount of active surface-to-air missile or SAM systems. On March 7, 2022, 11 days into the conflict, Pentagon stated that airspace over Ukraine is contested. During the initial attacks, Ukrainian radars, some air defense systems, and early warning systems were destroyed, and this complicated things. But Ukrainian forces still have a substantial amount of mobile surface-to-air missile systems, specifically the long-range S-300 missiles, the medium-range Buk missile systems, and the short-range Tor missile systems, as well as hypermobile 9K-33 OSA surface-to-air missiles. Additionally, Ukrainian forces were supplied with thousands of man-portable anti-aircraft missiles or manpads, such as the FIM-92 Stinger. It is also widely believed that NATO shares its radar and reconnaissance intel with the Ukrainian forces, which greatly mitigates the loss of ground-based radars. Modern SEAD tactics were developed by Americans during the Vietnam War, when countless American aircraft were lost to the Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missiles. The problem was that surface-to-air missile batteries could be moved around, and you couldn't just simply locate them to destroy them. So the US Air Force came up with an innovative but risky tactic. In the US Air Force, an aircraft that engages in the seed role is known as Wild Weasel. A pair of wild weasels were sent into the war zone. One aircraft would be used as bait, allowing enemy air defenses to shoot at it, which would expose the location of the defenses. The second aircraft would then target and destroy the air defense battery. Of course, the first aircraft had to avoid getting hit using electronic warfare equipment, as well as relying on the skill set of the pilot, which was learned over hundreds of hours of practice in the cockpit. Let me recap. You go in as bait, and hopefully you can take out the enemy before they shoot you. If you're thinking, you gotta be shitting me, then you too are qualified to apply, because that's exactly what the initials on the Wild Weasels patch stand for. The Wild Weasels are specially trained units that use specialized aircraft and anti-radiation missiles, or ARMS. These missiles work by homing in on the radio emission source of the radar antenna. They usually have a small warhead, which is just enough to destroy the radar equipment without causing much collateral damage. Additionally, aircraft specialized in seed missions carry electronic equipment that can identify SAM radars, forcing them to shut down, resulting in suppression of air defenses. Also, electronic warfare aircraft can be used to jam radars. Now here's the thing. For the most part, Russia has not engaged in seed missions. Just for reference, among Western allies, seed missions can make up as high as 30% of all sorties during the initial days of the campaign. Yet, Russians do not appear to engage in seed missions the way Western forces do. For this reason, Ukrainian forces continue to contest the airspace by shooting down Russian aircraft each day. Russians are obviously aware of all this, and so you would expect the Russian Air Force to engage in seed missions to destroy the remaining mobile SAM batteries in Ukraine. But are Russians capable of such operations? The Russian Ministry of Defense published a video of an Su-35S carrying two Kh-31 anti-radiation missiles. Maybe they are hinting about seed, but those sorties are typically done multiple times a day in order to be effective, and that one airplane came back with one of the two missiles still remaining. So how can one explain the lack of seed missions on the Russian side? First and foremost, Russia does not treat seed as an independent air operation, but as a tactical role during a larger operation. As a result, Russian pilots lack both training and experience in seed missions. Furthermore, Russian pilots lack training to begin with. While most pilots in the NATO countries accrue an average of 200 flying hours per year, Russian pilots receive anywhere between 60 to 100 flying hours per year. The US Air Force holds red flag exercises several times a year, where military pilots and other flight crew members undergo realistic air combat training. In addition to that, American pilots who specialize in seed missions receive 200 flying hours per year in seed training alone. And this is because seed missions are the most difficult of air operations, which require both intensive training and dedicated munitions. In contrast, the training for Russian pilots is not as comprehensive or frequent. Second, Western defense analysts argue that it appears that Russian Air Force is incapable of complex air operations. During the Syria campaign, most of the sorties were solo or in pairs, as opposed to more complex operations that involve dozens of airplanes. Ukraine has been using Tor and Buk short-range SAM systems against Russian helicopters and fast jets. So one would expect Russia to fly a large strike package to quickly find and strike any Ukrainian SAMs, which would have unmasked their location as soon as they fired. The Russians would likely lose some aircraft, but could eliminate the remaining SAMs and quickly establish air superiority. That is, of course, if the Russian Air Force had experience in complex air operations, but this does not seem to be the case. As a result, the Russian Air Force presence in Ukraine is pretty limited. Most sorties happen overnight and at low altitudes. The reason for Russians flying low is to avoid detection, because they have not neutralized the Ukrainian SAMs. Surface-to-air missiles are generally less effective below an altitude of 1,600 feet. Russian pilots may not feel confident flying high, but flying low is not without risks either, as they can be targeted using manpads. When it comes to dynamic targets, the environment remains contested. It's a big weakness for the Russian Air Force. Without air superiority, Russian armored columns are much more vulnerable to small mobile Ukrainian teams that use RPGs and ATGMs. Furthermore, it appears as if the Russian declaration of air superiority gave Russian ground troops fake comfort that they are protected from airstrikes. The evidence for this is that while armored columns include anti-air systems such as the Panzer missile system, those anti-air systems were not active, making them easy targets for Turkish Bayraktar drones. To be fair, those drones are harder to detect than manned fixed-wing aircraft. In the absence of air superiority, Russians will be even more vulnerable when entering cities. For this reason, some Western analysts believe that lack of effective siege by Russians can be fatal for their entire operation. As we said earlier, on paper, Russians should have easily achieved air superiority. In the past decade, the Russian Air Force acquired 350 modern aircraft such as Su-35S, Su-30SM, and Su-34 bombers. And yet, it appears that the tactics employed by the Russian Air Force and the skill set of their pilots have not been kept up with modern times. Now that you understand siege missions, you probably realize that enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine using combat aircraft can be quite dangerous. If NATO airplanes were to enforce a no-fly zone, they would have to fly inside Ukrainian airspace. But by flying inside Ukrainian airspace, they would be easy prey for Russian surface-to-air missiles that are stationed in Russia and Belarus. The Russian S-400 long-range air defense system has a range of 250 miles, which means NATO aircraft would have to perform siege missions to neutralize air defenses inside Russia and Belarus in order to fly safely over Ukraine and enforce a no-fly zone, which you probably agree would not be a very good idea. According to the Ukrainian government, during the first 15 days, they have shot down 57 combat aircraft and destroyed 83 helicopters. With that said, only 12 aircraft and 12 helicopters have been verified shot down independently with photographic proof. For comparison, the United States lost 27 airplanes and 5 helicopters during combat as part of Operation Desert Storm in a span of almost 7 months.
Уважаемые коллеги, начиная с по плану здесь на докладах